The whisper in the walls. Ellie had always dreamed of escaping the rush of city life. When she stumbled upon the listing for the Victorian house at the edge of a sleepy little town, she knew it was exactly what she needed. The price was shockingly low, even for a fixer-upper, but the real estate agent's hesitation when discussing its history didn't faze her. Old houses have stories, Ellie thought. That's what made them so charming. She signed the papers that same afternoon. The house was as grand as it was decrepit. Its ivy-covered exterior looked like it had been pulled straight from a Gothic novel, and the inside was no different. Dust-covered chandeliers, faded wallpaper, and floors that groaned underfoot. It was perfect, Ellie thought, even as she spent the first week cleaning and patching leaks. But as the days turned into weeks, small oddities began to creep into her new life. It started with the noises. Soft whispers she assumed were the wind slipping through cracks in the walls. At night, as she lay in bed, the whispers became harder to ignore. They didn't sound random. They sounded like voices, murmuring words she couldn't quite make out. One evening, as Ellie curled up with a book in the living room, a sudden noise made her jump, a distinct knock, sharp and deliberate, coming from the wall behind her. She froze, the book slipping from her hands. Just the house settling. She muttered aloud, though her voice wavered. To reassure herself, she rapped her knuckles against the wall. Nothing. But as she stood to leave the room, the knock came again. This time louder. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. The whispers seemed louder than usual, and she swore she could hear footsteps pacing in the hallway. Gathering her courage, she crept out of bed to investigate, but the hallway was empty. The only sound was the creak of her own footsteps on the floorboards. She glanced at the old mirror hanging above the fireplace as she passed, and for a split second, she thought she saw movement in the reflection, something darting out of view. The next morning, Ellie decided to shake off her nerves with a little work around the house. As she cleaned the mirror, she noticed faint marks on its surface. At first, she thought it was just grime, but as she rubbed the glass, words began to emerge, scrawled faintly yet unmistakably. "Help us." Her breath hitched. She stepped back, staring at the mirror. Old writing, she whispered to herself. Maybe from the previous owners. She told herself it was nothing, a remnant of the house's long history. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. Over the following days, the strange occurrences only intensified. Doors that she was sure she'd closed would be open when she turned around. Items she left on the kitchen counter would disappear, only to reappear in other rooms. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. Sometimes, Ellie thought she heard them calling her name. One night, as a storm raged outside, Ellie heard a loud crash from the basement. It sounded as though something heavy had fallen. Gripping a flashlight, she descended the creaking steps into the cold, damp space below. The air smelled of earth and mildew, and her light struggled to cut through the gloom. In the corner of the basement, she found the source of the noise, an old wooden chest that had toppled over. Its contents were spilled across the floor. Yellowed papers, rusted tools, and photographs. Ellie picked up one of the photos and felt her stomach drop. It was a picture of the house, taken decades ago. But there was something wrong. In one of the windows, barely visible, was a dark figure. A shadowy silhouette standing perfectly still. Ellie flipped through the photos, her hands trembling. Each picture was of the house, taken from different angles, and in every one, the figure was there in a different window each time. As she stared at the final photo, her flashlight flickered, casting the room in a momentary darkness. And then she heard it, a whisper, unmistakable and chilling, coming from directly behind her. "Leave." Ellie spun around, her flashlight beam shaking as it swept across the basement. There was no one there. The whisper came again, louder this time, echoing through the room. She bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind her. That night, she locked every door and window, leaving the lights on as she huddled in her bed, clutching her phone. Sleep didn't come. The next morning, Ellie resolved to find answers. She drove into town and headed straight to the library. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, hesitated when Ellie mentioned the house. "That place," she said quietly, "has a reputation." Ellie pressed for more details. Reluctantly, the librarian pulled out an old newspaper article. The headline read, "Family Vanishes Without a Trace." The article was dated nearly 50 years ago. According to the story, the family that had once lived in the house disappeared one night. Their belongings were left behind, food still on the table, but there was no sign of the family. Neighbors reported strange noises and sightings in the weeks leading up to their disappearance, but the mystery was never solved. Heart pounding, Ellie returned to the house, determined to gather her things and leave for good. But as she packed, the air around her grew heavier, colder. The whispers returned, louder than ever. She tried to block them out, but they seemed to surround her, coming from every corner of the house. When she stepped into the hallway, she froze. The photographs from the basement were laid out neatly on the floor, forming a trail that led to the basement door. Her hands trembled as she followed the trail. She didn't want to go back down there, but something compelled her to, as though the house itself was pulling her in. The basement felt different this time. The air was thicker, almost suffocating. In the center of the room, the old chest now stood upright, its lid slightly ajar. Ellie approached cautiously, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. She lifted the lid and found a single item inside, a mirror. The surface of the mirror was cracked, its frame warped with age. As Ellie peered into it, her reflection shimmered unnaturally. And then the whispers stopped. A chilling silence filled the room. "Help us," a voice said. This time it wasn't a whisper. It was loud, urgent, and coming from the mirror. Ellie stumbled back, dropping her flashlight. The room plunged into darkness. She felt something brush against her arm, cold, skeletal fingers. She screamed, scrambling up the stairs. But as she reached the top, the door slammed shut in her face. The last thing Ellie saw before the darkness consumed her was her reflection in the cracked mirror. Only it wasn't her reflection. It was the shadowy figure from the photographs, its glowing eyes staring back at her. Ellie was never seen again. Weeks later, a new family moved into the house. They commented on how strangely clean the basement was, except for one thing: the cracked mirror, now hanging on the wall. If you stand close enough, they say, you can hear whispers coming from it.